Good morning, everybody. Nice to see your face, Kaylin. Hi, Lily. We'll get people here eventually. Happy Friday. We've almost made it through a week. Did you guys all have a good week? Good, bad, ugly? Ooh, all right. I like the thumbs up. Oh, not so good for Laura. Well, we've got a minute or two. Everybody comes right at the last minute. Let's see. Want this. All right, you guys should be seeing my screen now. Oof, lots of people in the waiting room. All right, we should be getting close to starting here. And let's see. Oh, that chat was just meant to go to one person. I should be more careful. All right, well, happy Friday. Welcome to class. We'll go ahead and get started. Most of you have completed the syllabus questionnaire, but there are still a couple of you who need to finish, who need to do that. That is worth a grade, so make sure you get that done. And then just another reminder that Monday is the last day to either add a class or drop a class. And I will again post a new reading assignment for Monday. I'll try to get that up by the end of the day, and I'll kind of try to fill in next week on Moodle so you can see what's happening we're going to do a little bit of chapter 8 before we move into how animals use energy. So that's just a short piece of information about what we're doing. All right, so looks like we still have some people joining us, but we'll just keep moving on here. All right, so this month, the Ecological Society of America, the ESA, is celebrating the contributions of Black scientists. So they had a picture of this woman, Anjali Boyd, in an email that I got from them. And so I just wanted to let you know about her. I'm kind of an ecologist person, so I get interested in things kind of at the macro scale of biology, also at the organismal level. But Anjali is a marine ecologist, educator, entrepreneur. She got her BS in marine science at Eckerd College in St. Petersburg. She's currently a PhD student at Duke University, which is where my PhD advisor went to school. And she is a graduate fellow in the School of Environment. And one thing that you guys may not realize is that if you go to graduate school in biology,
I just started a Zoom lecture. Is there any chance I could call you back as soon as I'm done?
If you go to graduate school in biology or one of the sciences, usually you can get that paid for. And so a fellowship like what Anjali has is one way of getting it paid for, or oftentimes there are research associates or teaching assistantships that you can get. And so I didn't pay anything for my PhD, and I didn't pay anything for my master's degree either, because that's typically the way it works in graduate school in science. So if you think that you might not be able to afford to go to graduate school, you almost certainly can. If you get accepted, you'll probably get funding to pay for that. All right. Thanks for keeping me updated on who's in the waiting room. I will try to, I do get notifications, but when I'm talking, sometimes I don't notice that. All right. So last time I asked you guys to draw pictures of Genesis 1, and it was kind of fun to look at your pictures. And one of the things I ask you about is what patterns emerge from your drawings. And so I just wanted to show you a couple of drawings. One thing that was kind of new for me this semester, it seems like every time I have my students do this exercise, something new emerges from what you guys do. And this year, one thing that several of you guys pointed out is that on day 4, when God makes the lights in the day and the lights in the darkness, or the lights in the day and the lights in the night, he uses that to mark the seasons. And so a couple of you, like this group, put a calendar. Now somebody is making noise and I need to find that person because it's a little bit distracting. Okay, so it looks like everybody's on mute. You guys are welcome to unmute if you want to say something to the class, but I will, it's polite to kind of mute yourself so that there's not extraneous noises. So thanks for doing that, those of you that have put yourself on mute. And I might put you on mute if there's noise coming from from you that's distracting. Anyway, this was kind of interesting to me that you guys talked about the sun and the moon marking the days and the seasons. So that's kind of cool. Something new this year for me. And we looked at Genesis 1 as poetry. And I mentioned how the first 3 days show form and the days 4 through 6 show how God was filling the creation. And some of your drawings really showed this. This breakout group 9 really showed the parallels between days 1 and 3 and and days 4, 5, and 6. So I just wanted to show you guys this drawing in case you didn't see it. So in day 1, God was separating the light from the darkness. And in day 4, there's a description of the lights that were used to rule the day and the night. So God making the lights that would kind of fill the light and the darkness. In day 2, God separated the waters above from the waters below. So some of you drew the waters above as clouds, and some of you drew the waters below as water. And then in day 5, God filled both the waters and the sky with creatures. So he made the sea creatures, and he made like the things that fly. And then in day 3, God separated the sea from the dry land, and there was also vegetation that showed up in the dry land. And then in day 6 is when God filled the dry land with other creatures, animals and other creatures in the dry land. So you can see that parallel. And then we talked about the ancient Near Eastern cosmology. And then I suggested that maybe we were adding our own modern understanding of the cosmos to our interpretations of Genesis. And so, for example, some of you guys showed globes in your drawings, and some of you guys showed clouds instead of water for the water above and the water below. So this is just several of you kind of showed globes, and I claim that Genesis 1 does not talk about the earth being round. And so we kind of added that to our interpretation. Okay, and then we talked about the different perspectives. And then I asked you to tell me, oh, and by the way, I posted a link on our Moodle page to this website that describes all of these perspectives on what they call the creation evolution continuum. And so I would recommend that you read those descriptions, because I kind of gave you a quick summary of those last time. And you can go back and watch the video from Wednesday if you want to hear my summary of these, or you can read about them in the website. And so I encourage you to do that. On our first exam, I will ask you at least one question about the differences between these perspectives. And that the reason that I have for teaching you about this is that I just want you to be aware that there are more than two choices. So many people think that there's only two choices. There's either creationism or evolution. And I think that there are many more choices that are available to you. And so I asked you guys to kind of say where you fall on this continuum, at least right now. And I just wanted to share with you the results that we got. And so this is the graph that I made based on the results. And so we can see that about a third of the class self-identified as agreeing most with evolutionary creationism or theistic evolution, and almost a third of the class chose kind of the other end of the spectrum of young earth creationism. And then the rest of you, kind of the other third, are somewhere in the middle. And some of you, many of you said you kind of believed in a mix of a couple of these, or you were trying to decide between a couple of perspectives. And so we have a lot of variety in our class of different perspectives. And so what that means to me is that I think we need to be very careful that we are hearing from everybody, and I want to value all of your perspectives. I don't think that there is one right or wrong answer about how to look at creation and evolution. I would tend to be more toward this end of the spectrum, like about a third of you. But I also acknowledge that there are some problems with having a perspective over here that are solved kind of if you're over here. So I don't think any one of these perspectives is without problems. And so I just kind of wanted to launch from there into talking about some issues that are controversial. So what are some other scientific topics that are controversial within our society or maybe within churches? And so you guys can answer either in the chat or you can unmute yourself and suggest topics that are controversial. I'm going to open my chat so I can see what you guys are saying. And let's do these publicly instead of privately so that we can have kind of a more broad conversation in the class. One person put, okay, so we're getting some great answers in here and you can watch them as they're coming up. Stem cell research, genetic modification, contraception, abortion, the Big Bang Theory, evolution, sexuality, bisexuality. There are probably different things that could come under that. The difference between gender and sexuality, somebody says. Conversation around changing genetics, vaccine development. So a lot of your answers have to do with genetics, cloning, climate change, plastic surgery, where dinosaurs fit in the creation story in Genesis, evolution over time, GMOs, genetically modified organisms. Excellent. Excellent. So there are, let's see, what else? Okay, so I think I've seen most of the ones that have come in. All right, so there are definitely scientific topics that are controversial. So my next question is, I have a couple of questions for you. Why is it important for us to hear perspectives that are different from our own? How does science benefit from diverse viewpoints? How can science be harmed by controversies? And then how do controversies about scientific topics help or harm the church? So what I would like to do is I would like to have you guys discuss these in some smaller groups. So I'm going to randomly assign you to some breakout rooms. So take a screenshot of this or use your phone to take a picture of it so you have the questions. And then I'm going to go ahead and assign you to breakout rooms. And I'm just assigning you randomly again. I'm going to put you in 10 rooms. So there will be about 3 of you in each room. And again, when you get into your rooms, I would like you guys to introduce yourselves in case you don't know each other. Again, these breakout rooms are designed to help you get to know everybody in the class. And then I would like you to discuss these questions. Maybe what you could do is you could take turns answering these questions and make sure you get different perspectives. So I'm going to go ahead and open the rooms and you can go ahead and please join your rooms now. People are coming back.
So cold. Oh my.
All right, well, welcome back, everybody. So I would like to hear about what you were talking about. And so I'm just gonna randomly call on somebody. I have randomized a list of your names. And so the first person that I'm going to call on, if I can arrange my screen so I can see my list here. It helps to have two screens, but I've got too many things open on here. All right, so my first person that I'm going to call on is Hugo. Are you with us, Hugo? He was telling me that he might have to kind of go in and out. Okay, so we're going to skip to the next person. Caroline Redding, what did you guys talk about as far as the first question? Why is it important for us to hear perspectives that are different from our own?
My group kind of talked about how it's important to like hear the ideas of people who have different backgrounds from you, just because like they can have a lot of different like interpretations or like perspectives on things. And we also talked about how like there's not necessarily one right answer for a lot of things in science. It's just like a lot of different like ideas coming together. So yeah, that's basically it. We just kind of talked about how it's really important to have different types of people talking about things.
Okay. And I think it's important for us to learn from each other. Like the example in our textbook was the development of the printing press and how that relied on technology that came from different parts of the world. And so, so that communication from different people was important. So I actually think that science is a way of learning about the natural world. And I do believe that science is the goal of science is to find out what is true about the natural world. So I'm not sure I would agree that there are no right or wrong answers. That's true of some issues, I think, but science is, the goal of science is to find out how things really are. But on the other side of that, science always keeps in mind that there are limitations to science, and science always, any kind of a scientific theory is always subject to change. So scientists always have to have the perspective that they may not be right, and they have to be willing to look at new evidence that proves them wrong. So, okay, great answer. Now, next person on my list is Trent. So Trent, how about, let's skip down to question number 3 there, because we kind of talked about how science benefits from diverse viewpoints when we were answering the first question. But how can science be harmed by controversies? What did your group talk about there?
Yeah, so we actually kind of brought up like a specific topic in terms of like stem cells and how it's used to like modify, so to speak, what God has already created in other terms. And in terms of how it like science can be harmed by controversy is it depends on how society views it versus like our Christian belief too. So like it's really tough to say that with the stem cells that it's like a black and white kind of discussion or topic where yes it's good or no it's bad. And that's where it gets really uncomfortable or gets controversial, because there's just so many other perspectives too, where it doesn't necessarily strengthen your own, but it just creates a conflict or some kind of tension where it's kind of like something that goes within, but like a sort of like an argument or a disagreement, more like a disagreement between like what's socially accepted, and what could be scientifically proven, or even what could be proven in our own faith or in the scripture too. So I feel like it's because of there's so many perspectives, certain ones can kind of almost downgrade others while not necessarily strengthening their own, and it doesn't really benefit either person, depending on like
Okay.
the specific topic or viewpoint, so to speak.
Okay. So I was going to say something about stem cells. And now what I was going to say is lost because I was concentrating so much on listening to what you were saying. um, what other things did you guys talk about as far as how science can be harmed by controversies? Who else wants to share?
People aren't always willing to accept something just because it isn't like in their frame of reference yet. Like for the plague, for instance, they thought that it was usually that disease was caused by bad blood, and they didn't know about like bacteria or how bacteria was spread through like mice and things. But even if you did tell them, they wouldn't believe you.
Okay, so I think that you're getting at a really important thing. We've got these controversies in our society, and especially to the extent that a controversy is based on something that's not true, I think that can harm science, because like Serena said, even if you tell people, even if you were to tell people that the plague is caused by bacteria, which is true, they might not believe you. And so I think what I mean by science being harmed is that people don't believe science, or they don't trust in scientific findings because of controversies. So we might really disagree with using stem cells for research, and I think especially using embryonic stem cells is problematic for a lot of people, because those embryonic stem cells come from human embryos, and the process of getting those stem cells from the embryo destroys the embryo, so that embryo then cannot become a human being. And so so that is definitely there are definitely some ethical problems. And so if somebody then says, well, scientists are trying to do this research that's unethical, therefore I don't like science, therefore I'm not going to believe in anything scientific that people say, that can hurt the progress of science in other areas if people just don't believe it. So I think Serena, you bring up a really important point about people not believing science, or I wouldn't necessarily use the word belief, but accepting accepting things that we have learned by science. So I think that's really good.
Also, people who usually came up with new discoveries were usually like challenged. Like they used to believe electricity only flowed through like wires, not like within the air. And because that wasn't like the norm, or they weren't quite able to like, or the people weren't quite able to like prove that exactly, they just assumed that it wasn't true.
They just they just assumed that electricity wasn't true.
No, like electricity couldn't like travel through through like the air, like through like how static electricity in the dryer, you know.
Ah, okay. And like lightning is definitely electricity traveling through air. Okay. What other did other groups have other examples of how science could be harmed by controversies?
I think that in my group, we kind of talked about how controversy, especially in regards towards like science versus religion and faith, are often based around fear and insecurity in a lot of people's in like their own beliefs. So they'll react violently. I think of like Galileo, who discovered or who had the idea that the earth actually rotated the sun, but because people and the church especially was so scared of that, they were so scared of that different view, that view that went against what they believed to be how God ran the universe, they burned him at the stake. And in that way, they really harmed science. They harmed the progress that could have been made off that discovery at that time, by just shutting it down because they were scared of it. It was too much controversy. So they decided that instead of maybe like taking a step back and seeing that maybe God works in ways that we don't understand yet, maybe the universe is bigger than we understand, they just said no, and they burned the guy who was telling the truth, and they just went back to their own beliefs. So in that way, controversy harmed science.
Yeah, good example. It maybe slowed down the progress of science. Yep. Other examples you guys talked about?
We talked about like the wildfire spread of misinformation, especially when we see in our modern day society today, is that we often believe opinion over fact, and that can be really hard for people to accept, but it can also be really damaging to society in a whole. So that was just our main topic, was education and misinformation.
There does seem to be a lot of misinformation, and like you said, it spreads like wildfire with our social media. So yeah, I do think that science can be that, like the progress of science can be harmed by these controversies. And I do think it's a good point that there is a lot of fear behind some of these controversies. So let's move to the question number 4. How do controversies about scientific topics help or harm the church? So let me call on Respect to be the first voice on this one.
We discussed in the groups that
We're having a hard time hearing you.
Oh,
That's a little better.
Oh, all right. We discussed in a group that controversies harm the church, and the fact that they could add separation towards the church. So, certain people in the church agree with one scientific topic, and another group within the church be like, no, I don't think that's right. That it could lead to separation. Us being one and not.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there can be divisions in the church. And, if we think back to that graph that I showed you, we have really different opinions in our class about creation and evolution. And so we have to be careful that that doesn't divide us. We have to be careful that we're listening to each other and respecting each other's opinions. But yeah, definitely, I think that is one thing that can happen with these controversies is that it can cause divisions or can result in divisions in the church. What other things did you guys talk about as far as number 4 here? How do controversies help or harm the church? Let's do Kayla first.
Okay, so group 9 kind of touched on the topic of religious text and how, for example, the Bible has some topics that kind of are instilled in the church, and they kind of describe how things should be in life, and some scientific controversies like plastic surgery or something like that kind of go against that. So we kind of thought that was an example of how they go against the church.
Okay. So that would be an example of how certain technologies are actually like in conflict with the church. Am I hearing that correctly? Am I understanding that correctly? Okay. Kayla's nodding. So who else wanted to speak up?
I was just going to say that sometimes it can be helpful to encounter controversies because it sometimes can be like a reset for your moral compass to actually like think about that in terms of your beliefs and understand, you know, from what I have learned and what I believe, does that really align with what I believe? So
so that's really an interesting perspective, that controversies can actually be good for us. And that was not something that I was thinking about when I put this together. So I'm really glad that you brought that up, Allie. And I really think that while you are a student at Bethel University, while you're going to college, you will have the opportunity to encounter a lot of different perspectives, a lot of different information that you didn't know before. And that might feel uncomfortable, but learning about these controversial things might help you to kind of tear down things that are not good about your perspectives, or things that could be improved. And you can kind of build back a stronger foundation, maybe a stronger faith, a stronger like integration of science and faith, for example. So I think that was a really, really great thing to bring up. What else did you guys talk about in terms of controversies? Any other perspectives that anybody wants to share?
I think for controversies, I think it also has to do a lot of with trust and authority, like if to believe your science teacher or your pastor. So I feel like with that, it's very hard, especially if you're at a young age, like in elementary school, middle school, where you're still trying to find yourself and try to find what you believe in. It's very hard going back and forth and hearing two different things.
Mm-hmm. And so being exposed to science, and especially being exposed to a teacher who's very dogmatic about a certain way of doing science, might cause a young person to say, well, that must mean that I can't maintain my faith. So controversies can harm people's faith, I think. Another thing, and we talked about kind of how, when we were talking about how science can be harmed by controversies, we talked about people not being willing to accept scientific information because it's coming from science and we don't trust science. I also think that when Christians have certain really strong beliefs that are going against some scientific points of view, that can make it difficult for people outside the church to want to come into the church. So I think that certain strongly held beliefs can make Christianity not very attractive to outsiders. So I think it can hurt our witness. So I think that's another way that scientific controversies can harm the church. Okay, so thanks for engaging in this discussion. I have found it useful. Hopefully you have too. Whoops, went too far. So in your reading, you learned about, or you read about science, technology, and society, and you answered a question about why it's important for all citizens to be informed about how science works. And the question that I'd like you to discuss now is kind of feeding off of that. In our current polarized society, what contributions can people with scientific training make to our society, to our churches, to our communities? So I'm going to throw you back in your breakout rooms for a couple minutes just to talk about this last question. In our society, what contributions can people like you who are trained in science, what contributions can you make? So I'm going to open up your rooms again and send you back into them. All right, welcome back, guys. About 20 seconds, everybody else will be back. All right. So the next person that we're going to hear from today is Faith Norstad. How did you guys answer this question about what contributions people with scientific training can make?
So we answer that by saying like it's important because they can like help change minds or like show people a new direction, and just like it's kind of like another option almost. I don't really know how to explain it that well, but just like the idea that they can like show a new idea to people.
Okay, cool. How about Cullen?
I am unmuted. In our group, we kind of talked about how people people with faith in science can first of all make an example out of themselves and just exemplify that you can maintain these two passions. You can maintain a faith in God and a love of science. But also, I think in a pretty direct way, I think of a lot of the historians who have gone back into the Bible and back into history books and kind of made a lot of connections that said, oh, well, actually, David was a real king. He was king of Israel at a certain time. There is evidence that, Israelites were in Egypt at that time. So there's ways you can kind of bridge the gaps between the stories in the Bible and scientific fact and kind of make and really make the argument to some atheists who might be just closed off the Bible because they don't view it as a credible book, kind of make the point that actually there is a lot of fact in there and it's a historical document for a reason. You might be able to trust it even.
Awesome. So I think Dr. Collins in the video that you watched talked about how people think, it's either science or faith. And I really do think that you guys being trained in science at a Christian university are going to be able to be bridge builders kind of between people of science and people of faith. And I kind of see that as part of my role as a biology professor at a Christian college, as being somebody who can kind of hopefully bridge that gap and be a reconciler. So I hope you guys kind of take that on. What else did you guys talk about? Anything else that somebody wants to bring up? What contributions can people with scientific training make?
Our group, we talked about how sometimes people who are in faith and don't have a strong science background, they try to talk about the topic and they end up saying something that's incorrect or doesn't follow the science field. And it ends up making other Christians who are trained in science look sort of like dumb. Like I've heard people who try to like talk about evolution as a theory and they say, well, it's just a theory, but they don't understand that science, the definition of theory in science is different than maybe what people usually use that word for. So just trying to, like you said, bridge that gap and help people understand what terms actually mean in science so that when they're talking to people, they're using the correct terminology so that they can bridge that gap.
Yeah. And I think, one important contribution we can make is to kind of educate other people about stuff that we've learned about science. But it is a little bit tricky to always do that respectfully. And sometimes when I like correct people on Facebook or something, I'm not always very loving about the way I do that. So we do have to work at that. All right. Anything else you guys want to add to this discussion? All right. Very good. Yeah, so I want to move from here into actually talking about Darwin and the theory of natural selection. Now that we've kind of talked about controversies and whatever. And so what I'd like to do is, I suppose that you have probably been taught about natural selection before, and I'm going to try to teach you again about natural selection. Natural selection is something that is often misunderstood, like the word theory is often misunderstood. And so I'm going to try to teach you, I'm going to try to emphasize what it is and maybe what it isn't. So natural selection is kind of came out of a book by Charles Darwin. So Charles Darwin in 1859 published a book called On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. And in this book, there were two big points that he made. And the book is kind of thick, and it's kind of all one long argument in support of these two big ideas. And the first one is the idea of descent with modification, that species that are living now have arisen from a succession of ancestors. So species that are living now have descended with modification, with changes over time, from species that used to live many years ago. So, so this was supported by the record that we have in the fossils. And so we know from the fossil record that organisms that lived thousands of years ago differed from the organisms that live on Earth now. And so Darwin's explanation for that is that the organisms that live now are the actual descendants of those organisms. And then the second and probably the most important contribution that Darwin made to science is the idea of natural selection, which is not the idea that things evolve, but the mechanism for how that could happen. So Darwin was certainly not the first person to have the idea that species evolve, but he was the one that came up with the idea of how that could have happened. So, so the idea of evolution, the idea that the species are not fixed, that idea was really in the air at the time that Darwin was thinking and learning about natural history. And so what I would like you to do, as I said, I'm sure that you've been taught about this. So I would like you to just right now, I would like you to just write down in your own words. I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to do this. I would like you to describe natural selection. What is it? What is the theory of natural selection? Go ahead and write that down. I'm going to give you some time to do that. Or you can type it into your notes or whatever.
You want us to send this in the chat?
Nope, I just want you to write it down so you have it in front of you. You don't have to send it in a chat. So even if you don't like believe in natural selection, I want you to describe what the theory is. Okay, it kind of looks like some of you guys are, do you guys need more time? Who needs more time? Okay, it kind of looks to me like most of you guys are done. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to tell you how Darwin described his theory, and then you can kind of compare his theory with your idea of natural selection, see if it matches, see if you have it right. So Darwin noticed he was a naturalist, and he was actually his father wanted him to be a doctor, and so he started out in medical school, and then he just really hated it, and so he then switched to studying theology. This might be surprising to you, but he trained as a minister, and but he was really very interested. What he really loved was learning about nature, and so he collected beetles, and at one point in his life he exhaustively studied barnacles and learned about weird kind of barnacles that have weird kind of sex, and he wrote this monograph about barnacles. And he got interested in how plants breed, and so he had so he was just really interested in nature. So he was a naturalist, and he took this trip around the world on a ship, and the goal of the ship was to map the coast of South America. But his job on the ship was he was the ship's naturalist, and so he would go ashore and he would collect tons of things, and then he was always sending things back to England, all these things that he collected, fossils and animals that he would collect and kill and stuff and send back, and lots of plant specimens. So one thing that Darwin noticed is that within a population of individuals, and remember that a population is a group of organisms of the same species living in the same area at a particular time. And what he noticed is that individuals within a population vary. So the deer that are out in these woods out here, yesterday I was on a meeting and I saw some deer run by. Some deer run by. So they are not all the same as each other. So individuals in a population have variation. The second thing he noticed is that a lot of the traits that are different in different individuals, those traits are heritable. They can be passed along. So if we think about humans, some things that vary in humans might be some things that are really obvious, are like skin color and hair color, the size of your nose, various other things. Those are heritable. They are passed on from parents to children. Another thing that he noticed, and there was an important book that was written about the time that he was thinking about whether species are fixed or not. There was an economist named Malthus that wrote a book about how human populations can produce far more offspring than can survive. And Darwin kind of extended that into all kinds of populations of living things. Populations can produce far more offspring than can survive. If you were on campus in the fall, you may have noticed a lot of like berries that had fallen onto the path and gotten crushed. And so like the buckthorn plants that are on campus, they produce just tons and tons and tons of berries. Inside those berries are seeds. Most of those seeds are never going to germinate. That's one example of a population producing far more offspring than can survive. You've probably seen videos of turtles hatching out and then trying to make their way to the sea, and lots of them getting eaten on their way to the sea. So that's another example. And this is true of almost all populations. There are far more offspring than can survive. Because of this, there is competition within populations, competition for survival. Another observation that Darwin made is that species generally are well suited to their environments. So species that live in cold areas are well suited to living in the cold. Species that live in hot areas are more suited to those environments. And so based on all of these observations that he made, his conclusion was that individuals that have traits that are the best suited to their environment, they are the individuals that are most likely to survive, and therefore they are more likely to be able to reproduce, and they will pass those traits on to their offspring. And this I have put in bold because this really is the heart of natural selection, that not every organism is equally likely to survive and reproduce. So you have heard this talked about as survival of the fittest, I'm sure. But I think it's a little bit more accurate to say that there is unequal reproductive success, because it's not the survival necessarily that makes the difference, it's who reproduces. And so Darwin's idea was that nature kind of selects who gets to reproduce and pass on their traits to the next generation. So any organism that does not survive and does not reproduce, those genes of that organism, they do not get passed to the next generation. So natural selection is going to cause a change not within a generation, but over many generations, there's going to be a change. So the result of natural selection is over many generations, the population becomes more suited to its environment, because the traits that make you best able to survive, those are the ones that are going to be passed on to the next generation. So the competition within the individuals, within a population, is what kind of selects who is going to survive and reproduce. So if you did not have reproduction as part of your description of natural selection, you did not have a complete description of natural selection. If you describe natural selection just as survival of the fittest, you didn't quite get there. Organisms have to survive in order to reproduce, but there's no selection until reproduction happens. So evolution does not happen within a generation. And populations of organisms do not evolve because they are trying to evolve. It's just that certain individuals within the population are going to be more likely to survive and reproduce. And so those genes get passed on, not because they're trying to or because they have to. All right. So a really good example of natural selection is the coronavirus. And Dr. Collins talked about this a little bit in the video that you watched, how the SARS-CoV-2, that is the name of the coronavirus, the novel coronavirus. It is called, so SARS stands for severe acquired respiratory syndrome, and CoV just stands for coronavirus, and it's the SARS, it's the second SARS-CoV virus. The first SARS caused a disease known as SARS back a decade or so ago. So this is the second SARS coronavirus, very similar genetically to the original SARS coronavirus. And this is the organism. It's a virus. This is the virus that causes COVID. So COVID stands for coronavirus. Oh, what does it stand for? I don't know what the I is, but D is for disease. And it's COVID-19 because this virus showed up first in 2019. So as you can see here, the original virus was detected in December of 2019. And in the normal course of events, actually, let me show you this video. I think we have enough time to show this. Hopefully this will load. Okay, so let's play this.
New coronavirus variants have been detected in over 40 countries, including the UK, South Africa, Nigeria, and Brazil, where they first emerged.
Now health officials say a new threat is identified in South Africa.
British officials imposed a new lockdown across England.
Recent reports of a new, highly contagious coronavirus variant in the United States
In the US, multiple states have reported new variants or versions of the virus with mutations that could change how it spreads. New research suggests that some of these variants are highly transmissible, and at least one may reduce how well vaccines work. With countries around the world already facing escalating infections and overwhelmed hospitals, these mutations could make ending the pandemic more difficult. We'll explain. Like other viruses, the coronavirus spreads by infecting cells and then reproducing within them, creating copies of itself that spread throughout the body. As new versions are made, the virus's genetic code, which holds the instructions for building new virus particles, is copied over and over again. But the code isn't always reproduced correctly. Small genetic mistakes or mutations can create new viral variants. If the new version of the virus has mutations that allow it to spread faster than the current most common variant, it could lead to a surge in new cases. This is already happening in places like the UK and South Africa, where some of the newest ones were first found. Current data suggests the UK variant could be 50% to 70% more transmissible, but the research is still early. To determine how transmissible and dangerous a virus mutation might be, scientists run a series of experiments in the lab. The first step is genetic sequencing.
Genetic sequencing gets to the blueprint of what the viruses are. We can use samples and data from actual humans to figure out what the genetics of the viruses are.
To do this, scientists take a sample of the mutated virus and sequence its genes. Then, computational programs help scientists identify mutations.
Once we know what they are, and now we can see that, oh, well, this is an important population, we can start manipulating the virus. We can either start working with clinical isolates of that virus, or we can actually make the strains. So putting those individual mutations into the backbone of viruses that we already have.
After sequencing the virus, scientists test the variant in a lab.
What we do is we compare how well the virus replicates in different types of cells. And so there are two ways. We will just do infections and kind of measure the level of the virus over time in these cell types. And the other thing that we'll do is a competition assay, where we'll take 50% of the wild type, the original strain, and 50% of the mutant strain, and then compare how well they grow. If there's an
Okay, so I'm going to stop there primarily because we're running out of time in our class, and I want to get back to this slide, and I'll finish this up, and I'll make this link available to you guys so that you can watch the whole thing. But notice that he talked about allowing the viruses to compete with each other. So this is the original virus, and that virus mutated, and one of the mutations resulted in this strain called D614G. It's mutation D614G. And that one ended up being a lot better at infecting people. So it outcompeted the other variants of the virus. And so these variants ended up just not being able to reproduce as well. And so this one is the one that has taken over. And other mutations have happened. So now there's another variant that showed up in June in Europe. And there's another variant that showed up in the UK in September. And this one they think is more transmissible. And then here's one from South Africa that showed up in October. And so we have an example of natural selection that's happening in an organism that reproduces really fast. And so you can see that some of these variants end up not going on because they just get outcompeted. So this is an example of natural selection or evolution in action. All right, so we're at the end of our time, so I'm going to end here. And so look for an assignment that will be due on Monday, and I'll put that up by the end of the day. And thanks for coming, you guys. It's been a fun class for me. I don't know if it has been for you, but have a great day. Have a good